Hey Minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm the Bandit, and on this episode of Faction Factory, I want to talk about my chess faction, Checkmate. It's Marvel Week, which is pretty ironic because this faction is inspired by the Checkmate group of DC Comics. But that's not why I'm picking this faction. This faction, it's not my favorite that I have, but if you follow Marvel Comics, and you are planning on getting Disney+, you know that Marvel has a What If series that asks a series of interesting questions. For example, they might ask things like, what if Captain America had Iron Man's armor? What if Hydra had won World War II? What if Thanos snapped the other half of the universe? It just so happens that this faction is my What If faction, asking two very academic questions about Smash Up. This video is going to be a bit different, because I like to change things up from time to time. Instead of talking about what this faction does and who it partners with, I want to focus on how I arrived at what they do. A designer diary, so to speak. Because this is essentially a hypothetical faction, even more than most custom factions because of the what if questions, it doesn't make sense to invest time in specific pairings if players can't get past the two fundamental questions. So why a chess faction? I was in the mountains on vacation, working on my lore and legacy expansion, thinking about how much I hated the Grimms in the weeks prior when I was thinking really critically about the design space. The Grimm wanted specific minions on bases, and I started to think about wanting minions on specific bases. It led me in the direction of having particular constraints on cards, and because this was a lore and legacy expansion, I was drawn to the idea that there is an established mythology or universe for each faction, and chess felt like a natural blending of the two. Which is funny to me, because I am absolutely terrible at chess. Awful. Turing Jedi is always trying to get me to play, and I always refuse because we know that he would destroy me. I'm shockingly bad because I never invested the time and don't particularly care to learn at this point in my life. Read some of my material on determinism and replayability and you'll understand why. But chess is extremely influential in gaming and deserves to be represented, and I enjoyed the challenge of trying to figure out what they would do. I wanted a faction that was really particular in terms of acquiring thoughtful play. First, I thought about how you win chess, and you win by conquering the king. It's a game with both the threat of victory and the victory itself, and it reminded me of something I had questioned for some time, our first what-if question. What if Smash Up had an alternate victory condition? In many ways, Smash Up does have an alternate victory condition through direct VP accumulation. Sometimes it feels like the aliens aren't even trying to win bases. I recently shared a story about a time I won without ever being involved in breaking a base. I had wondered about alternate victory paths since a Titan tournament that J.Crew won. I was moderating, not playing, so obviously I was pulling for J.Crew to win, but it reached a point where he was inevitably going to win. He couldn't lose. Given the spread of bases, it was impossible for him to not be on a base, and all he needed was second place to win. He had the points advantage. I often ran into similar situations where I play ninjas, where I almost want to tell players that they can't win because they can't stop a shinobi from jumping on last minute and they can't score without me. It's a victory, but it feels anticlimactic, and I wondered if it had to be that way, if there was a way that the score didn't necessarily matter and that a faction never had to feel out of the game. And that's why I created Checkmate, an alternate win condition that was subtle and achievable, but not inherently overpowering. I wanted a card that could end the game early, and in its original form, it gave you a VP when you had 14 or more VP. But this didn't meet my initial expectations, and Turing Jedi rightfully mentioned that a card called Checkmate should never result in a loss, which this card could still do. I could go to 15, but you might have 16. And I decided that close was close enough in horseshoes, hand grenades, and Smash Up. If you could get to 14 on your turn, then you could play Checkmate. You could be in last and still win as long as you kept the pace. And it had to be on your turn, so players were safe on their turn, just like in real chess. Effectively, you can end the game early on your turn, and players had to be cognizant of the fact that for you, and only you needed one less VP, and they had to avoid situations where I could break a base on my turn intentionally not getting first because it wasn't needed or possible, and still win. It prioritized winners winning on their turn, and I liked it. But to ensure that this wasn't too easy, the overall strength level of the faction had to be lower. And that's where the idea of artificially constraining cards comes back. The chess faction needed to win early because they were not necessarily capable of winning normally. So how do I represent that? What do chess pieces do? Well, they move, obviously, but that's been done a lot. They also move and destroy, which has also been done. What makes them different? In chess, pieces can only move according to specific patterns. And that's when I got a truly crazy idea that makes no sense in Smash Up, but does in other area control games. The second what if question. What if the order of bases actually mattered? In Smash Up, the order of bases and where they are placed does not matter. We have an oddly designed playmat, but most players I know put them out in a row, because it doesn't matter. But what if it did? Smash Up is an area control game, and nearly every other area control game that I play has a physicality to the map. Places are adjacent to each other, and distance matters. Movement matters. Right now, all movement is global. You can move anywhere. That wouldn't change. Instead, what if a new faction didn't have that flexibility, and they were the only ones who suffered the limitation? It wouldn't change anything, because moving a minion is still moving anywhere. But this naturally fit in with what chess pieces do, and I developed the idea of bases that are adjacent and bases that are not. For the playmat, think of the bases as being numbered. If a base was one or more less from your current position, you were adjacent. If not, you were not adjacent. So the knight, who can never touch adjacent bases, is like a great white, but cannot hit every base. There is a safe range, just like chess. You can position yourself to avoid it, and the destruction is minimal, to prevent it from being better than the great white. In fact, great white is a class 4, and I view these minions as being around class 3.5. Close, but still weaker. The opposite is true of the rook, who can only move to adjacent bases. I understand that this isn't 100% thematic, as rooks move on a line, but I think moving to adjacent bases in particular is better in 2-player, and Turing Jedi, despite hating this idea entirely, insisted that the rook be objectively better than the knight as it is in chess. In 2-player, being positioned in the middle lets you attack either side, whereas being on the edge meant that you could only attack the opposing base. Of course, this changes in multiplayer, where the knight would be more powerful as more bases become non-adjacent, but I wanted a dichotomy of movement. As the chess player, you had to be particularly focused on where you placed your minions because you could not just move them to their true destination. Placement mattered, and vulnerabilities were intended. The bishop also moves in chess, but I had already covered both options. To have free movement is already done, and it would be a weaker cyclone, so I wanted a reason to move instead. After one of your minions moves to the bishop's base, you can draw a card. This helps you get cards, but signals to another player where the danger area is, because that's where you want your minions to move, obviously. This is strictly weaker than Go See My Sister of the Russian fairy tales, but reminiscent of the Imperial Dragon for yourself. Factions should rarely draw 2 cards per turn, but Checkmate relies on having specific cards because of their constraints, so I added a second source of cards, Deep Blue. To make it different, Deep Blue will grant a card after a minion moves there, but you must reveal it first. This is to give away information, because chess is a fully observable environment, and it's why Deep Blue was so adept at playing chess. This was my way of giving advantage back to the opponent. Instead of double features, I wanted the idea of mirror image cards, just like you have white and black bishops that will never overlap. I also wanted as many cards as possible to correspond to the particular minions. So Knight Takes Rook allows for 2 minions to make non-adjacent moves, while Rook Takes Knight allows for 2 minions to make adjacent movement. More flexible than Dingy in terms of who you could target, but less flexible in terms of where you could send them. And it's very possible that you could have the wrong card in hand. The idea of movement was particularly important because of what I wanted to do with the pawns. In chess, I think I read somewhere that having your pawns in a line as a barrier is very strong, and that's how they started. And we had just finished the Polynesian Voyagers, which wanted minions on separate bases, so it made sense as a pawn ability. The pawns were designed to be the opposite of War Raptors, powering each other up by being away from each other. But you can move them to consolidate power. However, this would not make sense as an ongoing ability, as they would drop in power, but it makes a lot of sense as a talent. You could activate their talents after having them separated, then move to consolidate, even though the checkmate movement is slow and inflexible. The pawns are deliberately underpowered, as the talent only brings it up to a normal power, but you do have 5 of them, so in a spread strategy, they can be quite powerful. That left the king and queen, and though you need to protect the king, the queen is extremely important, and I considered them as having equal weight. The queen is a 5-powered minion that can move to any base, just like the queen pretty much can in chess, but it needed to be better than Cyclone, so she has an alternate ability to lower the power of all opposing minions on a base. Basically, everyone bows down before the queen. This not only helps you win a base, but makes it easier for your rook and knight to take minions out. It's not as strong a reduction as Dangerous Waters, but it is mobile. To make this ability even more flexible, I created 2 actions to assist with the faction's general strategy of using talents. Rematch simply lets you use the talent of any minion, and it doesn't count as having used it during your normal turn, like a Phase 2 expert timing. Check is like expert timing, but without power counters to transfer. You can threaten victory by either moving a minion to the scoring base or using its talent again. This can mean boosting a pawn again, lowering power with the queen again, or activating a knight or a rook to move them on or off the base, depending on their direction. Of course, it means a lot to other factions as well, as it is like expert timing, but it can only target minions. So what to do with the king? I went through several iterations of this guy. I tried a version where the king gave you 2 VP for winning, but lost a VP if he was destroyed or discarded out of play. But 2 VP was too steep, especially for checkmate. 1 VP is too weak, as Great Worm can do more damage as a spread because it scales for all players. Although gaining 1 VP is not the same as losing 1 VP, and there are times when one is better than the other, and neither is strictly 100% better at all times. But it had to do more because of the ridiculously overpowered invader, and it made sense that the king would be able to grab any card from the deck or discard pile, which, on your turn, could conveniently be checkmate and win the game automatically. But you only get the king's ability if you were the only winner, which meant you still needed every bit of power you could get. As the king is so important to this faction, you need a means to retrieve him, which is why I created the Fisher King. It gives you a chance to search for the king, or to play him again, but only on a base where you have no minions, to prevent an easy way of getting 5 power and a VP and more. It's not uncommon for cards to grant extra plays on a base with no minions, and it made sense in this context. The last 3 cards were thematic cards that were really designed to encourage thoughtful play. I wanted them to be highly situational and not something you could readily use. If you haven't seen the pattern yet, this is not meant to be a straightforward faction. It was meant to combat any notion of C-base, smash base, where you had to be very clear on your intent with every play. The first is the idea of pawn promotion, that if a pawn reaches the opposing side of the board, it can turn into another piece, almost always a queen. So pawn promotion is an after-scoring special that can turn a power 1 minion into an instant mild-mannered citizen from your discard pile. The catch is, it has to be a power 1, and power 1 minions are rare, and for checkmate, it means that you have to have a pawn not use its talent, making it harder to break and win that base. The next card is intentionally really hard to use, and that is the Queen's Gambit. It requires the sacrifice of one of your minions, but it can take out an equally powerful minion in a way that most minions cannot avoid by placing them in the discard pile. but that really isn't a fair trade and not even a gambit. So I took inspiration from the classic card that I never think is worth it, Poopox. Before the sacrifice, you draw 2 cards, giving you information first. This helps you decide what minion to sacrifice, and if you chose the Queen, you can play an extra card. Basically, you are taking a gamble that one of the 2 cards you draw will be better than the Queen if you use this card to its full potential. You don't know what you will get at the time you commit to using the card, so it's also possible that this card never gets used, and that is by design. This faction should have few automatic plays. The last card, I must admit, is ridiculous. It uses an endgame that I've wanted to see for a long time, but was never sure where it fit or even if it should fit. I strongly believe that terraforming is the most powerful action because it pulls the rug out from under you and now you are on a separate base. But the minions still remain. Actions and titans leave, but minions remain. We've done a ton with minion movement and even a little bit of action movement, but we've never actually moved bases. And there is a specific chess move that gets called to mind, castling, where the rook and king sort of swap places with each other. So to really make position matter, castle requires that the rook and king be on adjacent bases. And if they are, you can swap those 2 actual bases, which would be unblockable because no minions, actions, titans, or even buried cards move. The bases themselves are the ones that are switching. This means that you could have a completely different reward set for what you invested in, but it's 100% predictable. It can only affect bases in play that are adjacent to each other, which is known at all times, and it requires 2 specific minions, one that is really easy to kill. But it can greatly swing the balance on 2 bases, swapping a 4-2-1 for a 4-3-2 or a jungle oasis swap, and I really wanted to see that style of effect in the game. Powerful, but highly conditional and predictable. I still feel like terraforming's overall effect is way stronger because you get your choice of base. But it all comes down to Checkmate. Imagine that a 3 VP base where you were winning is now a 5 VP base, and that's enough to put you into endgame status. Or you swap 2 bases that weren't breaking, and now both of them are. You can castle to swap the bases, you can use check to put you over the edge, search with the king for checkmate, and call it a game. I personally think that would be really cool as an alternate path to victory. For Smash Up, the idea of base adjacency is really radical. Some players might have trouble seeing that, and I understand it. There are only 2 rules that I know would change. First, when a card adds a new base, I think it's easiest to just add them to the right, clean and simple. And anyone who thinks that this breaks the playmat hasn't played Polynesian Voyagers. The one nuance is Weird New Worlds, the first card to add a new base and set the precedent for being bold. Because the next base doesn't get replaced, it's easiest to just slide the other bases to the left, like removing a link from a chain, rather than having a gaping hole. That's what we always did anyway to save space, and it maintains the internal alignment of everything else. Right now, without Weird New Worlds and cards like Idaho Smith, you could have theoretically had this rule from the beginning and no faction would have ever noticed or cared, which is why I think it's crazy but not game breaking. And because this is a what if faction, it was enjoyable for me to explore the ramifications of such a rule, and I think the game could actually support it. But you may hate base adjacency. Turing Jedi hates it. Overall, I think that this faction creates an unobtrusive modification to the design space and allows for a closer feeling to chess. And I think that alternate win conditions, if designed appropriately, could have a place in the game. You still have to break bases to get there. What do you think of the Checkmate faction? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.